That's funny.
Okay, so welcome back to Russell Street Replay. This is our second show that we're doing in our video format on YouTube, as well as our usual podcast platforms. After last week's interview with undrafted free agent Shamar Bridges, which was a blast. And today we're really excited to welcome Tej Seth, a research and development intern with Pro Football Focus. Tej, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on and talk about the Ravens with you today.
Yeah, so before we launch into the Ravens, tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of how, you first got interested in football, your experience at PFF, how that was.
Yeah, so I grew up a pretty big football fan just because that's what my grandpa and dad were really into. Even though my first season that I really followed football closely was the 0-16 Lions season, I was able to still stay in after that, and I've been really happy with being a big football fan and everything. But I didn't really get into the analytics side of things until my freshman year of college, when I got to school and I joined a football analytics club, and I started to really learn about like how data can be used in football and different stuff like that. But then we got shut down because of COVID and we had to go home for the school year. So while I was sitting in quarantine, I stumbled across a graph from Ben Baldwin, and I wanted to make my own version of it. And so I, looked up how to use NFL data with the R programming language, and started coding from there. And then I started posting graphs on Twitter and found out pretty quickly that there's a lot of constructive feedback that you'll get from doing that. I was really glad I started posting on Twitter because it was how I was able to end up getting into Pro Football Focus. Was they saw that I was doing public work on Twitter and that I kind of knew what I was talking about. So when they offered me the internship last year, I was really glad I took that on and was able to join them.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it was before this was reading some of your articles. What parts of data analytics and football interest you the most? Are there any specific like positions or scheme related things that interest you the most?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I really like watching, good quarterback play and like very high level quarterback play. So I'm always thinking about ways to measure quarterbacks relative to their supporting cast. We see that so many talented quarterbacks will sometimes end up on organizations that don't necessarily have the right support for them to develop. But then you have other instances where quarterbacks get put into really good situations and organizations that are open to their different skill sets. And you're very familiar with that with the Ravens and Lamar. Like, we don't know if Lamar was to go to a different team, if they would have been so good at putting in the run concepts to help him excel, and being able to put in the right scheme and stuff like that. So I've always been super interested in looking at quarterback play and trying to separate their supporting cast from that when we have statistics relating to evaluating how quarterbacks perform.
So it's interesting you bring up quarterbacks and supporting class, because that's like one of the probably the biggest conversation topic in Baltimore right now about the Ravens is, who are going to be Lamar Jackson's top targets. And my answer usually is, if you're looking for a true wide receiver one, and I think that's a pretty abstract term as it is, I think Bateman has the potential to be that guy. And I think Mark Andrews, for all intents and purposes, already effectively is that guy. Sure, he's a tight end, but I just think between those two, there's not this dearth of talent like people think. I'd love to see them out of that, but what do you think of their move to trade away Hollywood Brown and go with kind of this very pared back group of targets for Lamar Jackson now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was a huge fan of Mark Andrews' game last year. I thought he's always been, a really good tight end, but the way he played, through a kind of a weird year for the Ravens where they were very injury prone. They had different quarterbacks playing because Lamar got injured and Lamar was sick for a little bit, different stuff like that. But Mark Andrews just consistently was really good the whole season. And I think I would feel comfortable with putting him in the elite tight end category now with Kelsey and Kittle because of the way he played last year. So he's definitely a really good number one receiving option. And then Bateman has to, really take the next step this year, but he has all the skills to do that as a first round wide receiver that a lot of people like coming out of college. And he can be a really good number two receiving option on the outside. But I definitely think the Ravens should be looking to add a veteran or some type of player to not necessarily replicate what Hollywood Brown was doing, but at least fulfill one aspect of it. So if you go out and you get someone like a Will Fuller or a Deshaun Jackson, you can at least have the speed aspect that Hollywood Brown provided and have someone that can take the top off the defenses, which would be really important for the Ravens offense.
Yeah, I think I'm starting to come back around to the idea of Fuller. And part of it is, having talked myself into whatever's out there on the market. But I think the thing with Fuller is it was a broken finger last year. He missed a bunch of games in 2020 for a suspension. So that tag of injury prone has affected him in his career, but it's not necessarily year in, year out chronic with his legs or things like that with Julio. Which is part of the reason why I'd be worried about signing Julio over Fuller. I think Deshaun Jackson's another good option. I think one of the things that's interesting about the Ravens is, after this draft, they drafted 2 tight ends, and they're even talking about, moving Isaiah Likely tight end, like not moving him into being a wide receiver, but effectively using him as a receiving only tight end. Like he'll block, but trying to put him in as many receiving matchups as he can, just because he's got the size and speed. Do you think that they're going to be able to find success in the regular season? They always do, but in the playoffs with this run heavy offense, this tight end heavy offense, do you think that when it comes down to it late in these games against the Chiefs and the Bills in the playoffs, they're going to be able to keep up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's like a really good question, and something that I think needs to be kind of considered after what we saw last year. So, when you have a run heavy approach to your offense, you limit your range of outcomes and you don't have super wide right tail variance. Like super high elite level offense doesn't come as often. But for the most part, you're going to get really good offense consistently, right? You're going to be more consistent, but not have the wide range of outcomes. But then we saw with, the Rams going to the Super Bowl last year that they were very inconsistent on offense throughout the year, right? Like first 8 weeks, best offense in the NFL. They had a 4-week stretch where they couldn't really move the ball, and Stafford was throwing a lot of interceptions, stuff like that. But then, when the passing game got hot in the playoffs, they were able to do that. So with the Ravens run heavy approach, it's going to make them a really good regular season team. But when they get to the playoffs, it's going to be something that they're going to have to open up and air it out a little bit more, just because they need to, lean into the wide range of outcomes that, Lamar as a passer can give them. He could hit on a lot of passes and, do that for 3 straight games and take them to the Super Bowl. Or he could have a game like he had against the Browns on Sunday night this past year where the passing game fell off. He throws a couple interceptions and they don't move the ball. That's okay to do because, when you're an underdog playing against the Bills or the Chiefs in the playoffs, you want to increase that range of outcomes as much as possible and want to increase your variance. So that's the right thing to do when they get to the postseason.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting into better terms the importance of having that sharp passing game when you get to the postseason, because it's not just, you have to be able to pass the ball to win in the NFL. It's being able to get down the field quickly in those crucial situations. We saw that so many times this postseason. And yeah, your passing offense, the Ravens beat up on some pretty poor passing defenses last season, and Lamar looked really good doing it. But then, when your number 2 wide receiver is Devin Duvernay or Tylan Wallace lining up against, trying to think off the top of my head, I can't think of the cornerback duos in the AFC at the moment, but lining up against, a number 2 cornerback, it's not going to go that well for you. You're going to have a hard time. Andrews is just going to get doubled so much this season that I'm worried about their ability to open up the passing game. And yeah, the run game can get them through regular season, but they're really going to be put to the test in the playoffs. I think that's true even if they do make a veteran receiving addition here, because like you said, those guys like Deshaun Jackson and Will Fuller aren't going to put them over the top necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so something interesting about that we measure at PFF is we kind of see we look at on run plays using the tracking data how good linebackers are at flowing to the running back from the time of the handoff, like 1 second into the play, right? And so what we've seen with that is that just by having Lamar Jackson on the field, even if he's not holding the ball on handoffs, linebackers aren't moving as well to the running back than, with other teams. Like it's consistently every single year when Lamar is on the field for the Ravens, linebackers don't move as much. Then when he's off the field and Tyler Huntley is playing or Joe Flacco was playing a couple of years ago, linebackers move a lot easier. So, that's something that he provides that's not a passer, but can open up the middle of the field more is, these linebackers not being able to know exactly how to guard Lamar Jackson. So I think it makes it a little bit, he doesn't have to be an elite passer to take the Ravens to the Super Bowl. He just needs to be above average passer that has the rushing ability to kind of confuse defenses enough to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think that test of Lamar as a passer, I think, is where the disconnect between like the Ravens need to shell out every single dollar in the world for Lamar versus not. Because if we get to the playoffs year in, this year again, and the Ravens just don't have the talent in the passing game around him, it's really tough to evaluate him as a franchise quarterback when you can argue they're not giving him, the weapons to succeed. And then he doesn't look like some people don't think he's worth the massive contract. I think he's worth every penny, and I'm fairly certain a deal is going to get done. But do you think that, the way the Ravens offense is structured hampers his ability to really show off as a passer, or do you think it's just right for him?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, what I mentioned at the beginning was they had the right situation for him to come into, especially in his 2019 season when, he really took the next step and played at an MVP level. Was they had all the 12 and 13 personnel with Mark Andrews and Hayden Hurst and, different tight ends mixing in there that really helped him develop. But now it does seem like they need to get a true X receiver on the outside that can really, open up the offense and not keep everything so condensed for them right now. Because, the Ravens offense right now with Greg Roman is a lot of, where either Lamar is handing it off, Lamar is running, or Lamar is throwing over the middle of the field. And so defenses have really started to force him to throw outside the numbers. And like, that's kind of where he struggled. And part of the reason why he struggled there is because you don't have a true number one receiver that's like able to win one-on-one matchups when everyone else is condensed in the middle of the field. So you're right about it does make it harder to evaluate how he is, in regards to that. And like, that's definitely something I would want to see to feel more comfortable about him as a franchise quarterback, but he's totally done enough to deserve a massive extension. But, you just want to see one more step from him in the right direction to put himself in the elite quarterback category.
Yeah, I mean, I want him to get rid of those games like Cleveland last year, right? But I think the thing that I've seen is when he has receivers who can get open on the outside, he hits them. I mean, that was one of the things that he did. Actually, Hollywood Brown was surprisingly good as an outside receiver for how small he is because of that, because of his connection with Lamar, because of Lamar's ability to hit him outside. But he just didn't have that chemistry with anyone else since he's been in Baltimore. And I think that hopefully all the workouts he's getting with Bateman and just more time with everyone this offseason will help. He had COVID and, different random days where he'd miss practice a lot last season. So I think that's another thing that, you realize in hindsight how important that stuff can be. So another thing I think that a lot of people talked about the Ravens is kind of them not taking a wide receiver after trading away Hollywood Brown, and instead there was actually a lot of support for their draft class, but then there were a lot of those post-draft breakdowns where the NFL executives give their insider secrets, and there were a lot that I felt like are criticizing the Ravens. There was one from The Athletic that quote that went around a lot that said, they try to roll 11 in Vegas instead of 7. That's Baltimore in the draft, because they went like safety, center, injured edge rusher, and interior defensive lineman with the first 4 picks. Do you agree with that criticism? Do you kind of push back against it a little bit?
Yeah, I found that criticism really weird when I was going through that Athletic article because he called the Ravens an outlier in the draft, right? And they weren't the only team in the first round to take a safety, because the Bengals took Daxton Hill and the Vikings took Lewis Cine, and the Ravens easily got the best safety of those 3 to go in the first round. And then they weren't the only ones to take interior offensive lineman as well. The Chargers took Zion Johnson, Texans took Kenyon Green. And then if you really want to talk about an outlier, the Patriots took a guard who was supposed to go in the 2nd or 3rd round there. And then again, like the Ravens got the best out of all the interior offensive linemen, the highest on consensus boards. And, both Kyle Hamilton and Tyler Linderbaum were being talked about a couple months ago as the best prospects to come out in their respective positions in the last couple of years. So, other teams were taking the same types of positions that the Ravens were taking in the first round. And the Ravens were just getting better value on those positions because they were taking the best prospects for each one.
Yeah, and I think that's just kind of their MO. And the question is the kind of positional value revolution ever going to come to Baltimore? I think the way their offense is set up definitely helps them with that. Because again, they value tight ends really highly and wide receivers not as highly, and that really helps them in the financial market in terms of how much money's getting thrown around. But I do think there is somewhat of a risk when you're banking on all of these picks to hit. Like when they waited until the fourth round to get a cornerback, which I thought was really surprising because usually this team loves their earlier to draft their cornerbacks on day two, especially. And so it's, again, you mentioned earlier, it's really interesting to just watch Baltimore because they have a plan. It's almost like it just has to take its time to reveal itself. There's a saying, on Ravens Twitter, it's just in EDC we trust. And that's partially because I have no idea what this roster is honestly going to look like by the time the season rolls around, because there's probably 5 or 6 guys that made the team last year that I could see us that are still around that I could still see us cutting, because I think that there's got to be some kind of move coming, and it can't just be Justin Houston, even though I think he's going to come back.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, that's really true. Is like, I think the Ravens were revealed a little bit of their plan to us with this draft class. And just the whole offseason in general, right? So we know with new defensive coordinator Mike Macdonald coming in, my friend Arjun Menon at PFF pointed out that last season the Ravens were in 2 high shells about 47% of the time, and then Michigan's defense, where Mike Macdonald comes from, had 2 high shells at 67% of the time. So we can see that they're going to go from a lot of single high stuff to more 2 high stuff, which is kind of the future of the league right now. And then it also shows us by paying Marcus Williams $70 million and drafting Kyle Hamilton at 14 overall, they really think that the value of safeties is going to be a lot higher. And they're really banking on safeties. I'm not saying necessarily be more important than cornerbacks in general, but more important than they used to be relative to corners, which is why they invested so much in safeties this offseason. And like you mentioned, waited until later in the draft to take a corner.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like there was a time where we talked about playmaking safeties every single week, whether Dawkins, Reed, Palomalu, Sanders, like every week. And, there are a lot of great safeties still now in the NFL, but they're not as prominent players in the league anymore. And I think that the switch back to all of these 2 high shells that the Ravens are certainly embracing, and they're making an active decision to embrace it even more so with drafting Hamilton. I mean, they have 2 free safeties starting free safeties on their team now. Hamilton, I think, definitely is built to play downhill in the box more, but he still has plenty of range to play free safety. And what's funny is they got burned so badly last year on so many plays. Partially, yeah, they were injured, but just in general, that it's almost like such a not an overcorrection, but a very clear correction for an issue last season. But that's, like you said earlier, that's not necessarily usually the kind of thing you see for the Ravens where they react right away. So I'm very curious to see what their defense looks like this year, how many times they roll out 3 safety sets if they hold on to Chuck Clark, because there have been rumors about him getting traded too, because I could see them playing with probably 6 defensive backs on the field on probably a majority of their, maybe not a majority of their snaps, but a lot of their snaps this season, maybe more than any other team, just because they've built up talent there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely could see, if they do hold on to Chuck Clark, them rolling out the 3 safeties a good amount. And I think that would be, exactly what you want, especially in the AFC North when you're competing with the Bengals and the Browns for the division. Those teams are going to be based off explosive passing attacks because that's what their quarterbacks excel in. And so you want to roll out the defensive backs that can stop that attack. And maybe you'll, lose some ground in the run game there, when defending both of those teams. But you really need to stop their explosive passing plays if you want to win the division this year. So I think it's the step in the right direction for their defense. It's just going to be a lot of new pieces, with with both corners coming back from injuries and then both safeties kind of being, brought into the system and everything. So it might take a little while to get going.
So another thing that I'm kind of curious to see about this season, because it got, again, a lot of press last season, is how aggressive is John Harbaugh? Because we've covered the fourth down decisions, the 2-point conversion decisions that honestly there were very few I didn't agree with last season. Some of them were very analytics driven. A couple of them, people were blaming analytics when he actually did the opposite of what analytics suggested he should do. So what are your thoughts on how aggressive Harbaugh was last year? And what do you like? Do you agree with it? Do you think you should continue to do it in 2022?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I really respected John Harbaugh's aggressiveness in all areas of the game, especially last year when it made a lot of sense to do what he was doing, right? And like when you're an underdog, the longer that a game gets drawn out, the less chance that you have of winning the game. It's just like the law of large numbers or the law of averages. And so by going for two twice in those situations against the Steelers and against the Packers, when the Ravens were just beat up and injured and were not the best team in both of those games, you had the opportunity to kind of like steal a win right there and then, instead of kicking the extra point, going into overtime, and probably having a less chance to win then. So I really like that. But as long as the Ravens stay healthy this year, they should be a favorite in most of the games that they play. So you'd want to see him adjust to that, as the season goes on. And if he has that opportunity to win the game by going for two, he probably shouldn't do that this season as long as the team is healthy, because you would want to extend the game as much as possible, given that you have the better team, to give yourself the opportunity to win in overtime.
Yeah, and I think obviously that's kind of what we're hoping for, is that the team stays healthy. And I think that's another thing that people kind of conveniently forgot about last year, was just that, at the end of some of these games, sometimes these injuries happened during the game. Like I remember the Steelers game, we were literally out of cornerbacks on our roster to put in, that we would have had probably, I don't even know who, like our safeties literally just had to stick them out wide and hope they could hang on in coverage. And, Ben was for some reason slinging it that day in that Steelers game. So it's also at the point where you're almost forced into a corner with these decisions. And so I think he likes to just go with his aggressiveness and go with his gut, which is, I think, something the fans appreciate in the moment, even if they groan about it afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and and it's just really interesting that like the process was sound there, and like we both agreed with the decision. It like stinks that the result wasn't good, because like that's what most fans react to, is what ends up happening. And like if they just converted one of those, like it would have been a totally different conversation. But since both of those 2-point conversions failed, and people came after him, and kind of like the analytics for that and everything.
Yeah, and again, there was the scenario. I think it was the Browns game when he went for two at the end of the Browns game. He should have gone for two when he was down. I can't remember when you're
Down eight.
eight.
Down eight, yeah.
Yeah, when you're down eight, you should go for two instead of when you tie it up at the end. And the analytics say go for two down eight, which is what he did in a different game. I can't remember which one that was because it happened so many times. But it was just really interesting to see, how this almost this live decision making process carried out. It was almost, I mean, as unfortunate as all the injuries were, it was almost a really interesting experiment to just watch how the team battled with it, because you wonder throughout the season, like, okay, at what point do you phone it in and just start getting the younger guys out there? And the Ravens were like, no, we're still going to try and make the playoffs and just see what happens. And I think that's because they fully believe that if they have Lamar Jackson, which, as it turns out, who knows if he would have even been back for the playoffs, but if they have Lamar Jackson on the field, they think they can win pretty much any game that's out there. Which I just hope he gets the chance to do that more often against the best teams this season. I think that's the thing I miss more from like the 2019, is just not just beating teams, but beating good teams. Like we beating a good Rams team. It just feels like with the how competitive the AFC in general is now, there's just a lot of good football.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So like that's what's something is really interesting to watch this year is, not only is the Ravens division really good and has three teams that you could see making the Super Bowl, with the Bengals making it last year, with even though there was a lot of luck involved, in that, since they've done it before, so they could do it again. The Browns now, now that they've massively upgraded at quarterback, they could do that too. And then the Ravens are also going to be Super Bowl contenders there as well. But then when you expand out to, the entire league, you can see that, sometimes when a team is the best team in the NFL, they don't win the Super Bowl that year just because of variance and because other opposing teams are going to be building their rosters to stop who they think is the best team in their side of the conference, right? So like the Bills were the best team in the NFL last year and they didn't get the Super Bowl out of it. The Chiefs were the best team 2 years ago and they lost in the Super Bowl. And then the Ravens were the best team 3 years ago and they didn't get out of the divisional round. So when the league is kind of going one way with all the too high stuff and players getting faster and better at coverage on defense, the Ravens run heavy approach might be kind of like zagging when the rest of the league is zigging and could really take advantage of the other defenses being more prepared to stop the pass instead of stop the run.
Yeah, and again, it's again trying to having spent so much time analyzing the team and writing about the team, it's easier to be a little bit more detached and be just excited to see what happens, because the way it's going right now, the Ravens are going to need some pretty big plays from Isaiah Likely or Charlie Kolar in the playoffs if they want to make the Super Bowl. One of those two guys as a rookie is probably going to have to make a play in a big moment at some point, because they're going to double Andrews. I think by the end of the season, Andrews and Bateman are just going to be seeing double teams all the time, unless another guy on the team has really stepped up in the regular season, which with the run heavy offense and so many targets going to Andrews and Bateman, there's not going to be a ton of opportunity for that to happen. And I think it sets you up for moments in the postseason where these players who you have drafted and put your faith into on both sides of the ball. I think Tyus Bowser is another really good example. He's coming off his Achilles tear, but had some really great moments last season. The Ravens really believe in him as an impact player on defense, but he hasn't done that in huge moments against really good teams yet. And so part of it is a lot of these guys, they're just going to have to live up to what the Ravens see in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the importance of secondary receivers becomes really important in the playoffs as defensive game plans start to become more tailored to the specific team instead of what the defense usually does. And that was especially prevalent in the 49ers Packers playoff game last year, where once the 49ers, put a lot of attention on Devontae Adams, the Packers offense just didn't look like it usually looked. So, I do think it's interesting the Ravens are going to bet on a rookie tight end really stepping up to kind of open up their offense and become their third receiving option. But, if that's like really the final piece of the puzzle for them, I think I can see like why they would want to count on that instead of, some other teams that have to count on multiple pieces coming together for them to make a Super Bowl run.
Yeah, and I think it's I guess it's not just Likely or Kolar. It's one of Duvernay, Tylan Wallace, James Proche. There are some undrafted guys who were on the practice squad last season, like Benjamin Victor, who like have talent. It's just not clear that they're going to be able to produce in those big moments in the playoffs when you're facing the best defenses in the NFL. Can James Proche, Devin Duvernay convert a 3rd and 12 in the fourth quarter? That's going to be the test. But I also think that's going to be the test of, it's going to equally be on Lamar to make those plays because, mathematically, Lamar is one of the guys that changes the math of football. And if there's, if everyone's covered downfield, that means Lamar is probably going to have room to work between, the line of scrimmage and the first down marker to try and run for it. And so I think that's one of the things that the Ravens are kind of betting on him being the exciting player he is. And to a certain extent, it makes it fun to watch, if not, a roller coaster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, Lamar is more than capable of doing that in the playoffs. Like, in the Titans game 2 years ago, they won that game because of his 50-yard touchdown run right before halftime. It was kind of a lower scoring, more of a grind out game. But because of that really explosive play that he had that the Titans didn't really get in that game, like, he was able to do that there. So, and then, you can see like there's a narrative about Lamar Jackson that like, oh, when he's put in pure passing situations, he doesn't do that well and, different stuff like that. But that the statistics don't show that at all. Like there's a metric called expected pass based on like down distance, score differential, all that stuff. How likely is a team to pass on a play? And so when Lamar Jackson, or when you filter it and you see, okay, are when a quarterback has a 70% chance or greater to pass, how do they end up performing on that play? Lamar Jackson is ranked third behind Patrick Mahomes and Aaron Rodgers since 2019 in high expected pass situations, like pure passing situations. And that's because either he's passing pretty well in those, or like you mentioned, everyone's covered and he's taking off and scrambling, even though when he's dropping back. So he's very capable of doing that, and it has to be pretty exciting to see how that's going to turn out this year.
Yeah, I think it'll be a fun season. And kind of on that note, what couple things are maybe you most looking for from the Ravens this year? How do you think they'll do? Do you have like a rough record prediction? Will they make the playoffs, Super Bowl? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So one of the things I'm really curious to watch this year with the Ravens is the aggressiveness on fourth downs. And that's because John Harbaugh has adjusted his fourth down aggressiveness based on how good he thinks his offense is. And so you can kind of get a picture of how much he trusts his offense to convert based on his fourth down decision. So in 2019, when the Ravens had the best offense in the league, he was going for it on fourth down 60% of the time when the fourth down models recommended him to go for it. But then in 2020, when the offense wasn't as good as it was in 2019, he had a 5% decrease in going for it when recommended to. And then last season, he was only going for it on fourth down 43% of the time when he was recommended to. And that's just because the offense wasn't as good last year. They're playing a backup quarterback, different stuff like that. So early in the season, I'm really curious in seeing how much he trusts his offense to convert fourth and ones and fourth and twos, and that'll give us a good feel of what he thinks about them. If I had to give a record prediction, I would say the Ravens go 11-6, win the division narrowly. It would probably come down to week 17, week 18, and then make the playoffs. And probably if they're in the wild card game, I could see them winning that, but it's going to be tough for them to really beat out the elite of the AFC, the Bills, the Chiefs. So I could see probably division game as a divisional round as their most likely outcome.
I think the team that scares me just flat out more than anyone else is the Bills, because they just got better this offseason and were already the best team in the NFL, like you said. We got the Chiefs monkey off our back last year. We're gonna have to try and get the Bengals monkey off our back this year. But I think the Ravens will be in that kind of underdog vein by the end of the season, entering the playoffs. I think their schedule after their bye is a little tougher than the schedule before their bye. And so I'm hoping that, like, historically, maybe this is just a feeling, but like, it just seems like Harbaugh gets this team playing better when they're underdogs. In 2019, they coasted off of being favored in a lot of games. Then they walked in and got crushed, because maybe not because they were crazy overconfident, but they were the favorites in that game. And that's part of the reason why they got crushed. And it happened again, against the Titans. And so it happened again against the Bills. They finally got the Titans off their back, and they go in and lose to the Bills. And so I think they have to have a little bit more of that chip on their shoulder, as people, as the NFL league wide not believing in them as much, because I think that's when Harbaugh and this team typically get it together the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you with the Bills assessment there, and that week five, right? Week five game against them, should be a pretty big measuring stick for exactly where the Ravens are at, right? Like the opening game against the Jets isn't going to tell us much, and maybe the first couple weeks won't as well, but that Bills game is going to be pretty huge in determining, all right, are the Ravens just a good team that'll probably make the playoffs, or are they a legit Super Bowl contender that has a revamped defense, a third receiving option breaks out, different stuff like that can really propel them to the next level.
Yeah, I mean, Bateman has to. I mean, I feel like I'm treating Bateman's breakout as a given, and I really shouldn't, because he still has to do all those things. He flashed last year, but still he didn't have that crazy of a year after he got back from that initial injury. It's not like he was, frequently rookie of the week or anything like that. And so I think that's maybe the biggest key, the biggest question mark for the Ravens that I think a lot of people are treating like a given, but has to actually happen, I think, for them to get anywhere this season. He really has to be the first round receiver that they thought he would be. And honestly, he has to do better than Hollywood Brown did. I think that they have to get better. And so if he's moving into that top wide receiver slot, he has to do better than Brown did last year. I think he can. That has to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. That's a really good way to compare him to Brown is how well Bateman does there. And that could be the next step for the offense for sure.
Yeah, because, they're low. It seems like they're loath to pay big money to a wide receiver. But if Bateman turns out to be that guy with Lamar, then you might want to lock that down as your pairing. But my last question just was more of a fun one. Are there any like NFL players, and I'd say one offensive, one defensive, it doesn't have to be plausible, that you would just love to see on the Ravens in their scheme?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, this is a great question. I thought about it, and so I really like the Ravens run game, and I think it's cool how diverse it is and how much dressing there is to it and stuff like that. And so it would be really cool. They struggled with tackle play last year, right? And it'd be really cool to go out and get Trent Williams or something in a hypothetical world where you have the best run blocker in the league, like easily, right? Like there's no debate about it. And he could just maul people over in the run game. And you could just have Lamar or Gus Edwards or J.K. Dobbins on the left side, just running free, untouched for 10 yards, which would be a lot of fun there.
They could literally pull a blind side and just run gap behind Trent Williams and just pick up yards with the way their run game is.
Yeah, no, it would be really cool. It would be sweet. On the defensive side, I'd really like to see let me think. Like it'd be cool if they got, an interior defensive lineman that could really help them run a lot of the too high stuff without having to worry about getting gashed up the run in the middle. So, it doesn't even have to be like an elite interior defensive lineman. It could just be, someone from Sebastian Joseph Day, but you could go all the way up to like DeForest Buckner or Chris Jones or something. Just someone there with Trevon Jones that can really help and like, make sure that their defense is going to be as versatile as possible this year.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of interesting thing about the Ravens is that it seems like they already have a lot of their playmakers, and it's really going to come down to what can their defensive line, on the edge. I'm less worried. They're usually pretty good at like holding the edge against the run, but really can their interior defensive line, control that point of attack, both against the run and even a little bit disrupting against the pass. So I know they're hoping to see that out of Travis Jones, and that's why they brought back Campbell, but it is not there currently. We have not really seen interior pressure in Baltimore yet. So we'll need those guys to take steps this year. Tej, thanks so much for joining us. This was really a pleasure. I really loved hearing all the stats and analytics that you bring to this, and really great to meet you. And hopefully we stay in touch, and love to have you back on again in the future. I know it'll get busy during the football season, but hopefully we'll be able to work something out.
Yeah, no, the pleasure was all mine. It was a ton of fun to come in here. I really enjoyed this conversation. And if I do come on again, I'll make sure to get a cool background like you have on Zoom here, so I can match up there. But yeah, thank you again for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Thanks so much to everyone for tuning in.